Hello, everyone. My name's Robin Ewing, and with Professor Michael Anderson, I co-direct the Create Centre, Creativity in Research, Engaging the Arts, Transforming Education, Health and Wellbeing. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Darug country. The University of Sydney stands on Gadigal land. You might like to put your acknowledgement in the chat. I also want to acknowledge that our First Nations Australians are our original storytellers, and that they put story and the arts at the centre of their doing, being, knowing and becoming. And we have so much to learn from that practice. We know that Aboriginal land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to this presentation. As we go through, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, you might like to record them in the chat because there will be time for questions. And this and all our Create webinars are recorded, so you'll be able to share the link with others if they haven't been able to join us today. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Jed Evans, who is a lecturer in English at the University of Sydney. Jed and I met at a whole day forum on crime and punishment. And I'm just been amazed at the work that he's doing. He also is the associate editor of Paper Chained, which is a journal of creative expression for people who are behind bars. And that's what his research and practice revolves around. And how can the arts work for the good for those people who are incarcerated? I won't say any more. Jed, you might tell us more about all of that. And thank you so much once again for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure. Well, thank you for everyone for being here. I'm going to not cover everything that I want to say today. And I'm going to be fairly flexible, I think, or I'm going to hope to be flexible. So if there are things that I say, or if you have questions, I don't mind being interrupted. It's probably a good thing. I also have an acknowledgement that I'll put on screen here, because I do want to pay respect as well to the Gadigal people who are the traditional owners on the land where I'm speaking from today. I'm at the University of Sydney. But I need from the outset to acknowledge the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across all nodes of our criminal justice system. So to that end, I wanted to also pay my respects and my gratitude to the Darug people, who are, I suspect, disproportionately affected by the infrastructure of prisons in Sydney. Both Parklea Correctional Centre and Francis Greenway Correctional Complex are the spaces that I work, and both of them are on Darug land. And then if I was to try to acknowledge all of those that are represented in the criminal justice system, language and nation groups, I couldn't, in those two centres, let alone across the whole system. So what I have here is that I hope that in doing the work that I do, I'm not only respecting that knowledge that's embedded within Aboriginal custodianship, but that my teaching practices and research practices undermine or work against systems that would disproportionately impact First Nations people. So that's my acknowledgement to start. I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm slightly nervous about the first one now that I see that Garner Clancy is here, who is definitely much more of an expert than I am, and who is the host of the forum where Robin and I initially met. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the New South Wales prison context but I'm really cherry picking for the purposes of talking about what's relevant to the work that I do. So I'm not going to try and speak as a criminologist. I'm speaking about the cohorts that I work with. I'm then going to talk a little about how I have seen corrections justify the arts on the inside. And I'm tempted, I guess, to sort of see how well we do as an institution in justifying the arts, because I suspect that we do not much better sometimes at least in the way that we publicly speak about what the arts is and what it does. I will probably more kind of tend toward the like writing arts, creative writing, poetry, prose, because that's what I do. But I will also have some art and imagery up. And I should say that most of the imagery, if not all the imagery that's included here, is in some way either by incarcerated people, like the one on the screen that you see here, which is included in an amazing book called Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, which is a book that I will spruik always. But there's also art of prisons as well. I'll talk a little bit about what I do, and I'll see how much concrete work I can get to in that. And then I will end with a little sort of intimation of what I think we can do, or maybe even what we should do. So that's where I'm heading. So first things first, I kind of feel like running a trivia show and saying, does anyone know what's on the screen here? Can anyone recognize the Darlinghurst prison that's being represented here? That's now, I think one of our art schools uses it. But this is our first one, the New South Wales prison context. I'm not going to give you a history. I'm just going to talk about the cohort that I work with. So here are some relevant custody statistics for the work that I do. This is the most recent data I could get from BOXAR, which is the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. At the moment, which is to say since March 2023, there are 12,555 adult offenders, which is how BOXAR and corrections refer to people who are in custody as offenders. As of March 2023, of these, 4,879, so almost 40% are on remand, which is just to say that they were, they're inside, not sentenced, but couldn't get bail. And then there's 3,709 that are Aboriginal, which is almost 30%. And one statistic which is relevant for me, recently 834 are female. So just to give you a sense of those numbers, the reason that I'm referring to them is I work predominantly with remandees and also with women, so sentenced women. So those are my two kind of cohorts that I work with, and pointing out just the kind of horrifying statistic around Indigenous overrepresentation. Most of my writing workshops are probably, I would say, between 4 or 5 out of 12 men typically identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander in any one class. So between December 2021 and December 2022, our remand population increased, our female custody population increased, our Aboriginal population increased, both for men and for women, not for me, that should say for men. And just to give you a sense of I don't want to say of the kind of success of our prison system, but just to point out that the Premier's priority is to reduce the amount of reoffending that happens for people who have been sentenced. Of every person incarcerated in 2010, more than half were reconvicted within those 10 years. For young people, so if you were incarcerated when you were less than 18, the likelihood was that you were 81%, 81% of that cohort would be reconvicted. And if you are over 46, it's more likely that you won't reoffend. And so this is kind of well known for criminologists and sociologists, that age is a huge determining factor in whether people commit crime. If you're young, you might do it again, and at a certain age, you are less likely. Of those who are Aboriginal and convicted, I should say, in 2010, 86% were reconvicted. And so I should say, even though it's within 10 years, most reoffending occurs within the short term, within 5 years. And for young people, more than half are reconvicted within 2 years. So I guess I say this just because one of my favorite sort of examples that I ever read when I was going through historical prison reform was a prison reformer working out of a New York jail in the mid 19th century, who said if you visited a hospital of which more than half of those going in came out as sick or sicker, you would say that there was something wrong with the hospital, not with the patients. Okay, that's just a thing to say. So this is the Sydney context. Now, these numbers change and fluctuate depending on what's open and shut. I'm talking about facilities here. Again, I'm mindful I have a criminologist in the class with me. So I'm talking about different transitional centres. Some of these prisons have multiple centres within them, within a kind of complex. But it's worth noting that we have a lot of correctional facilities in New South Wales, and these are adult correctional facilities. I'm not including youth justice facilities here. And so 3 of those are privately run: Parklea, Junee, and Clarence. Now, Parklea is a prison that I work with. Junee and Clarence, GEO and Serco. Clarence is the newest. It was opened, I think, only in 2020, and it's massive. It's got about 1,700 people inside. In the Sydney metropolitan area, we've got 16 of those facilities. So if I was to kind of constitute our metropolitan, you've got Emu Plains, which is hosts very few women, predominantly mothers, and some Aboriginal women as well who are in a special program. You know, we're talking maybe 30 or 40 women out in Emu Plains, and John Moroney as well in the west. So that's kind of as far west as it extends. And then Matraville. It's nice to say Matraville because everyone knows Long Bay, but when you mention that it's in Matraville, you're like, oh, it's the eastern suburbs. 3 of those centres, all of which are in Sydney, so none outside of Sydney, accommodate female inmates only. Dilwinia, Emu Plains, and then the women's part of Silverwater. Private facilities, and this may shock some people, I'm not sure, but private facilities account for about 1/4 of every person who's incarcerated in New South Wales is currently inside a private facility. So Junee is the smallest. Parklea has about 1,300, Clarence 1,700. There was an unprecedented growth between 2012 and 2018, which is for, again, someone like Garner or his colleagues to explain. It's mainly to do with sentencing. And many New South Wales prisons, including Parklea, where I work, started double and triple bedding in order to manage folks inside of cells. And so since that period of time, so we're in a kind of a burgeoning economic and infrastructural change in our prisons in New South Wales. We've had 2 so-called rapid build pod prisons that were opened in Cessnock and Wellington to help with overcrowding. So solution for the increase was to build more prisons. And in 2020, the Sydney Morning Herald also reported that state government was planning another prison out at Camellia, which is sort of Rose Hill Racecourse Way. I haven't heard what's going on. The most recent budget estimates is saying that they haven't lodged the development application, but that's a massive expansion point in Sydney. But just to say that the correctional mindset, at least in our recent history, has been a kind of expansionary one. Okay. So education. I'm going to talk about how I got into all of this, by the way, but I just wanted to give you context, and I hope it's helpful. People, my suspicion is a lot of people don't know anything about prisons in New South Wales. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put more faces on my screen so I can get a sense of whether I've got human beings nodding or not, or whether I'm sort of all on my own here. So Corrective Services provides educational and vocational training to incarcerated people as part of what it calls its adult education. That's not Co-National Training Institute. It's got a training institute as part of what was called the Making Prisons Better initiative out in 2016. Many prisons reduced or removed educational staff, many of whom were Federation teachers. There were a lot of TAFE contracts and Education New South Wales contracts that were halted. A private contractor came on called BSI Learning to do basic numeracy and literacy training to sentence inmates. So the context that I entered into prisons was a context, I guess, as you could see, of a expanding population, a change in the kind of infrastructural environment, a kind of continual increase in the number of incarcerated people, a proportionate increase in women, Aboriginal people, and the remand population, and also a kind of downgrading of the programming around education. Just to give you, I guess, a sense of the specific arts education space, there are 3 galleries. I wonder if anyone has heard of these before. There's the Boomgate Gallery, which is in Long Bay. There's the Girawa Arts Centre out at Bathurst, and there's also the Cooma Craft Gallery, obviously in Cooma. Long Bay pays the men who have art there. They give them 85%, and then the rest is absorbed as kind of cost for hosting the art space, giving them materials, etc. Girawa doesn't pay the incarcerated people. Instead, it pays the centre. And then Cooma requires those who want to display anything in the gallery to pay for their own materials, and they can't sell to the public. The prison where I work at, Parklea, has corporate sponsored gallery events, so they're not, they don't have a kind of public facing gallery. And they also pay the men inside up to 85%. In terms of music, probably the most well-known program that's running at the moment is a program called Songbirds, which is directed by musician Murray Cook, supported by the Community Restorative Centre, which I should say also partly funds Paper Chain, which is the journal that I work on. And it engages professional songwriters and artists to support and teach and mentor people in prison. Anyone that I work with inside of prisons typically knows about Songbirds. It's a kind of bright light of a program in the midst of not much. There have been programs such as Red Room, which is based just out of Darlington, called Poetry Unlocked, but I haven't seen it operating in many years. All right, so I'm kind of giving you a big context here. Is this all clear so far? Like, this is awesome. All right. I should also point out, given where I'm speaking from, about New South Wales prison programs running out of universities. I'm mindful that I'm glad that maybe I don't have folks in the room who know more about this than I do, because this could come off as kind of snarky, and I don't mean it to be snarky. I actually mean it to be kind of anxious and sad. But I know that there's a PhD student studying controlled environment agriculture at UNSW, because whenever I ask anyone in corrections what education is happening, all of them mention that one student. And UNSW has done a bunch of self-congratulatory articles about the fact that they have one student studying a PhD. But if you look proportionately at the number of people who are inside and the number that have meaningful access to tertiary education, you might as well have 0 proportionate to the number who are inside. Which is to say that if we have one PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, everyone would know who they are. And that's what Corrective Services has currently in New South Wales. We have no long-term strategic partnerships between, and I should say strategic educational partnerships. That's not to say that there aren't industry connections, but between Sydney-based universities and local correctional facilities for generating a kind of degree-based educational environment. There is the only ones that are running at the moment that I know of are typically ones like what I run, which is sort of an individual person or a single discipline. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 63% of prison entrants had what they call an education level, which isn't to say when they graduated, but the level of year 8 or below. Prison entrants were less likely than a general population, 19% compared with 64%, to report that they had completed the equivalent of year 12. And in terms then of creative collaboration, so moving away from kind of degrees or educational pathways, in terms of creative collaboration, the best example that I can say, and again, I'm saying in New South Wales is probably Dreaming Inside by Arnie Barb Nicholson, which runs out of Junee Prison, which is a writing program for incarcerated Aboriginal men. And if anyone is in the room who has done the FAST 3999 case study with me on writing inside of prisons, they'll know about this program. But again, it's to say that if you mention programs that are successful or that are kind of running, they typically are the exception and not the rule. Okay. So is that a fair overview? I hope it's not a huge downer, but is it sufficiently a downer to say, like, there are serious problems and that we're in an environment at the moment, particularly when it comes to education and the arts, that you could describe as fairly desert-like? So why the arts? And I guess my answer to this is also why poetry in particular. But I'm never going to say no to any artistic form. There's a long history of theatre running running in prisons, obviously visual arts. But I've got pen and paper, and that's actually the cheapest and most accessible form of art making inside of a prison space. So that's what I choose. Okay. So this is the way that corrections answers this question. I'd be curious. I also have two of my colleagues, Hugh and Liam, in the room, and I wonder if they've heard similar justifications for how we talk about our own discipline at the university, if they align in any way. But this is how corrections typically answers the question of whether or not we should have something like the arts inside. Clear evidence shows that prisoner participation in meaningful education, and this comes from a strategy document from Corrective Services, is associated with desistance and reductions in reoffending. And desistance is just a kind of process that involves a permanent and positive shift in the way that a person sees themselves and perceives their sense of identity and belonging. So correction says this is how we know that the arts works. It's a conduit for psychological insight. They love, in particular, self-awareness, self-confidence, and resilience. The arts works when it provides positive pro-social, which is to say, if that's not terminology that's familiar with you, just know what's antisocial behavior. So pro-social experience. To this end, it's often framed therapeutically. So a lot of the art programs that I see inside of corrections see art, kind of, I guess you would say, like a poem as a kind of salve, right? As a Band-Aid or as a solution for a psychological problem. It's good to paint because painting helps you deal with trauma, for instance. Arts works when it creates a space to get away from, quote, the yard. So that's to say that the arts provides alternative spaces or alternative ways of thinking inside of a prison. I guess anyone who's interested in kind of spatial theory, you might think of it as creating a third space inside the prison itself, a space that isn't the prison, but is something other than the prison. Corrections also sees the arts working if it creates a community, groups, writing groups, workshop groups, groups of artists, groups of men and women who see a kind of identity that produces a supportive environment where they can help return each other to a kind of social well-being, which is one of their big models, return to social well-being. It also enables men and women to own their own story. It provides a space for people to tell a story that is their own, as opposed to the experience of many incarcerated people, which is having a story that is told about you in court and by police and etc. The arts works in the corrections mindset when it develops an appreciation for learning and facilitates the capacity for learning. So, if we have the arts, maybe people will want to learn other stuff as well. It gives you something to hope for. It gives you something to be determined to complete. It gives you things to make. It creates opportunities for supporting each other and recognizing achievement. And this one, I have to say, I agree with corrections about, and I don't disagree with corrections about a lot of these outcomes, but it's interesting, I think you would agree, to see the ways that art here is framed in quite instrumental or prosaic ways. But here, I was just working with a group of women at Dilwinia Prison, and one of them said in a letter to me and the other facilitator that she'd never been applauded before after she read a poem in class. And that struck me as a kind of incredibly profound thing for someone to say. What does it mean for somebody to recognize your achievement while you're inside? The arts also generate skills that, quote, might lead to vocational outcomes. You know, a lot of the language at the moment, particularly with things like work integrated learning, is the idea of like what kinds of skills, soft skills, do the arts permit people to develop? And corrections does, I think, buy into this as well. You know, yes, we've got people reading poems or painting, but they're also developing certain kinds of skills like, you know, self-awareness and critical thinking, I guess, that might permit them to get jobs on the outside. I am particularly skeptical about this one. And then it gives something people to do with their time, right? Which is a very real thing and shouldn't be shunned. Prison is very boring. It's an incredibly boring place to be until it's not, I would say. And then this final one, which I've bolded, and it's a kind of funny one because we know that people engaged in arts programs have a lower reoffending rate, but there's not necessarily an easy line to draw between, you know, a poem and not committing crime again. But it's an interesting one that kind of exists in the background. All right. Now I'm going to ask you a set of questions that maybe I'm going to leave unanswered, but let me kind of have them there as a set of provocations. And if you want, as Robin mentioned, please, you know, attempt an answer in the chat. If you're too nervous to do it, you know, you can send it privately as well. But I guess, how do we answer this question? So if the question, if you remember, is this: why the arts? And if we've got a set of answers from corrections that are more or less satisfying, but certainly make sense within that ecosystem, how do we answer it? And by we, I guess I mean people in this room. I mean people who buy into the university. If we just simplify, so let's forget the arts in general. Like, let's say that maybe you find it difficult to imagine how experimental theatre could be useful inside of a maximum prison, but you can kind of get on board with creative writing. Well, what good is poetry, actually? What good is it for an incarcerated man or an incarcerated woman, like for incarcerated people? What good is it? What is the point or value of a poem, particularly one that we read together? How do we even begin to describe, quote, value? How can we quantify it? What metrics do we use? I think one of the most interesting things that's happened for me in working inside of a prison is being asked to answer questions that I realize that our own culture is quite squeamish or uncomfortable about answering, right? Like, what do these things do? What's the good of doing them together? You know, what does a poem actually do to us? Does it need to do anything? Is its worth or the value of poetry based on what it makes happen in the world, and where does it happen, right? Does it happen in us or in around us or in some sort of strange cosmic or spiritual realm? Does it happen in our souls? Does it happen in our minds? My suspicion is some of us have answers for this that we rarely need to articulate. And that I was speaking to a group of philosophy students about this very thing, and somebody said to me, you know, this, like, why is poetry worth doing? Like, what's the point of it? And that question kind of reveals to me the state of things, I guess, that we're in institutional environments where we're asked to defend something that feasibly in different moments in time we would have found it kind of spurious or unnecessary to defend. Why read a poem? Is a wild question, but it's a question that I wonder if we know the answer to, if provoked. What about a poem that's written by an incarcerated person? And this is something that I'm interested in. Is there anything peculiar or strange about poems that are written in the conditions of incarceration? So in spaces of, you know, deprivation, in solitariness, in confinement, with the kind of sense of impending doom, with a sense of hopelessness, with a kind of branding as being a quote unquote bad person, a criminal, right? Is there a difference between what a criminal says and what that person said before they were sentenced? What's the value of poetry for them as a tool for expression? I also read a lot of bad poetry, right? A lot of bad poetry, formerly a lot of self-serving poetry. And And then, is there value in bad poems? And what do I mean by value? And what does a kind of bad poem do? This actually struck me recently, and I'm going to say something that I will want to leave unanswered and unprovoked after this, because I'm raising this a little cheekily. But one of the things that we have a lot of hand-wringing about in culture is, what do we do with works of art that are by people who are bad people, or who have been revealed in some way to be bad people, right? And it's this idea, like, I guess famously Hannah Gadsby's point about Pablo Picasso, and there's in Brooklyn at the moment, they're doing a kind of gallery exhibit, which is a kind of anti-Picasso exhibit, and it's talking about like art by quote unquote bad people. And it strikes me that in some ways that attitude is an extension. It's an extension of a kind of carceral mindset, right? There are some kinds of people that we don't want to hear from, and certainly not the real bad ones, the ones that have been convicted, the ones that are inside. And it's a question that I have to work with all the time. Why listen, or why ask people to generate work who are perceived as bad people? Now, there's stuff in the chats as well, and I think, you know what, I'm gonna kind of come back to that as well. But there's some really beautiful thoughts, I think, that, yeah, thank you for answering them. Please keep answering these. Here's a weird one. Is there like a good prison poem to read? What do we do? What poem would you choose? Right? Liam, if I'm looking at you on the screen, what poem would you choose to teach to somebody on the inside? Is there a bad poem to teach? Are there poems that, quote, wouldn't work? And how do you know if it will or won't land? Do you just bring a set? What's the measure that we have? What kind of invisible or intuitive forces are going on where you think this is the poem that's going to do something? This is the poem that's going to achieve the thing that I wanted to achieve. And then, of course, the question is, what is the thing? And then what happens to us, I guess, is that final question. If we are ourselves in the thrall of a work of art, if we are keeping the company of something that is beautiful or profound or strange or unnerving or unsettling, but is itself art, what happens to us? And then what happens when we do that with other people? And then this is my leading question, which is what happens if all of that is happening inside of a drug and alcohol recovery wing in a maximum security prison, which is where I do it. There is a hand. There is a hand. I'm happy to take. I said that I'd be happy to be interrupted, Natasha. So go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So thanks for this. This is really interesting. Sorry I was late. No, I guess my biggest thing, talking about poetry, even though technically he wasn't in a prison, but Baruch Bachani, we've all heard of his story, and he's done some poetry as well. And he went to a Brisbane talk relatively recently, and hearing his poetry, even now getting goosebumps, I guess the truth does come out. Like, you hear all these things that are happening in the media and all these attention centres, and it must have been very cathartic to put it down into words again, to knowing that English probably wasn't his first language. He had to get it translated, but just to be heard, I think, for him, and for us to just hear what is really going on. Like, a lot of people think, oh, it's not happening, it's not pushing away. But after hearing his story, and I admit I have only heard one poem, and I do want to read more, but a lot of it is just so goosebumpy stuff. And as a nation, or anyone who's writing their story, why would they make something like this up? It needs to be told. So I guess for me, thank gosh he did it. I just, and I think a lot of these, like, everyone's got a story. And if it means writing in a poetry is easier, I don't know if that's the right word, but if writing a poem, or they can make it, yes, it's what they're experiencing, but somehow it can take them out of the picture, but put them in the picture. Does that sort of make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, I appreciate that, Natasha. And I share your admiration for Beirut as well. I'm working on a piece which is ostensibly about No Mind But the Mountains, which was the book that he published on via WhatsApp, and scurrying that material out. And the reason that I'm working on the piece is because I work for a prison that was previously owned by a group called Ferrovial, who ran Transfield, and Transfield ran Manus Island. And the ways in which the capital from initially Spain and then from America made its way through an arterial highway also built by that same organization in Houston, Texas, and then finally out into a tiny island in the Pacific, is to me incredibly revelatory about the ways in which human capital and kind of prison capital have been internationalized, and actually how Australia is in many ways the kind of beneficiary, and has always been the beneficiary of kind of the penal form of colonialism. And so I think Beirut is, and the point that he makes in that book, or one point that he makes among many, is that things need to be named precisely. That Manus is not a regional offshore processing detention center, but that it's a prison. And that by naming it as a prison, and then by describing it as a prison, and then by kind of, I guess, ritualizing through the ritual language of poetry, ritualizing the experience of what a prison is like, he kind of gets the last word on Manus Island. And I think that his work has inscribed that space so much as what he described it as, that I think it's very difficult for many of us to see it as anything relating to, processing folks coming in, and to think of it much more as a space of confinement and imprisonment. And to use the language of poetry to do that, I think, is because a lot of other language felt inadequate to the task. Merely describing was to kind of succumb to the language that the government used to describe its own operations.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
And again, it begs the question, what are prisons for?
Well,
I mean, there are awful people in the world, don't get me wrong, but you've got to often wonder, does prison suit the punishment, or punishment suit the prison?
Let me continue talking, because I will get to that point.
Sorry.
To that point. No, don't be at all. I also want to just really quickly, if people don't mind, just because I'm mindful that this will be a recording and not everyone will see the chat window come up, let me just really quickly read what people said when I had those provocations. So I'm not going to name you all. I'm just going to read what you said, because otherwise it will sound like I'm a teacher. So expression and vulnerability, taking a risk by creating something new, creative exploration, sharing thoughts, speaking a poem creates a path between feeling and body. It's embodied. Poetry is like breathing. It allows you to attend to experiences outside of yourself. Creating and appreciating art encourages open-mindedness and understanding. Reading poetry reorganizes the world. It unsorts, dissolves it, and remakes it. Literary or poetic language and creativity and engagement are good for people, and just people in prisons are people. I'm coming back also to vulnerability, but safe and unthreatening vulnerability. Poetry permits, or this kind of creative work or art creates catharsis, casting out thoughts or feelings, putting it into something else, or relating more to those thoughts and experiences or those of others. The arts are integral to who we are as human beings. Poetry helps us clarify and understand. I feel like I need to just take all of this. I'm just going to copy everything. Arts allows engagement with an expression and processing of a range of personal and collective experiences in ways which value subjectivity. There's so much. Okay, maybe I'm going to get it impossible to get through there. And then a few people have made some suggestions, like teaching the letters, the Paul's epistles, which I have done actually, and then teaching Oscar Wilde. Yeah, and then someone's posted a quote from Svetlana Alexievich: "What can art accomplish? The purpose of art is to accumulate the human within the human being," which is a lovely line. Yeah. And now Hughes asked a question, which maybe I'll get to as I kind of describe what I do in my own work. Okay. How are we going for time? Okay, we're doing all right. So what do I do? I'm going to be really concrete here because some of the more cerebral, aesthetic, lovely thoughts have just come through in the chat, and I really appreciate that. And I find myself doing that all the time, providing a defense in terms that I think are explicitly human but can sound like lofty to the wrong audience. And very often I'm trying to describe what I'm doing in the context of a prison or a university, neither of which I would say are easy places to justify teaching the arts, which might be a wild claim. All right. So I work in a couple of different ways. So let's talk first about Parklea Correctional Centre. Parklea is privately operated. And can I say, before I get anywhere else, I am incredibly suspicious of private prison operators. I think that should be just said and acknowledged. But it goes without saying that I also recognize that there are 1,300 people inside of a private prison, and I'm more interested in working with them than in being squeamish about working inside a private prison. So the vast majority of Parklea's incarcerated men are on remand. It's probably about 2/3. They do have a minimum security sentenced part of the prison. I don't work with them. I work inside maximum, and I work with almost always remandees, which is to say that I have a classroom of a revolving door. Sometimes I might see someone once, sometimes I'll see someone for 2 years. It depends entirely on how sentencing is working. Parklea is operated by MTC Australia. It's a branch of a Utah-based management and training corporation. It's also family owned, which is one of the weirdest things that exists in my mind, is to have a family business trade in prisons. They currently operate 22 job corps, 23 correctional facilities, 13 prison and detention, medical departments, community release centers, detention centers like ICE centers in the States, workforce development. They have about 8,000 employees, and the only foray into Australia at the moment is Parklea. They also run Nauru now. They've taken over administration, and so they run an empty centre. I guess with the idea that if it ever starts up again, they'll be there. I've worked with Parklea for over 4 years, and I work in a Success for Life program, which kind of weirdly, this picture is almost definitely, well, it's not exactly, but it almost looks exactly like the room that I work in. So it's, you know, that I don't have that sort of that room up the top, but I've got a room very similar to that. Every week I drive out to Parklea, and then I run a 2-hour writing workshop. And I should say that writing is very loosely defined. I have a colleague who's been in with me who's in this meeting, and he came in, and when we did this kind of work together, there was a lot more discussion than writing. So it really depends on what the theme of the week is. It involves things like free writing exercises. I give them weekly writing homework. They have worksheets. It's much like any creative writing class. All of the men opt in. That means that no one can be forced to do it, and it's not part of a program where they're obliged to do it. And I kept it that way for a number of reasons. Number one, because I think that it's a very confronting thing to be asked to talk with other men inside of a prison, to share creative work, to read work that you've written. Many of these men have a very low sense of their own capacity or literacy or capability. And so the idea that I would have a room full of people who were unwilling participants wasn't particularly attractive to me. I also wanted to make the class something that people wanted to come to, as opposed to forcing them to come. It means that sometimes I might only have 5 men, which is usually if I've got I'm in the middle of a program where a lot of people have been sentenced out and I'm getting a new group of remandees. Typically, I have about 12 who will come into a class during any single week. All of them are remandees. At the moment, I've got an 18-year-old and a 58-year-old. So it's kind of like a class with mature age students. Parklea pay a research account, which I in turn use to pay 2 research assistants who work with me on looking at the efficacy of creative writing workshops, working on prison writing archives, and one of them has been incarcerated before. My classes are structured around a theme or a reading. Some classes are repeats, but I don't have any kind of therapeutic design. I'm not thinking about, if I get you from class 1 to class 12, what will happen to you? Because sometimes I might get someone for 1 week and then never see them again. So it's a difficult class design in the sense that every class has to kind of be adequate in and of itself. So I'm mindful of how much time I have here. I can show people any of these things, but this is just a list of things that I've done recently. I wonder if I can. No. I'm nervous that if I get rid of the screen, it's all going to go. It's all going to go wild. Oh, you know what? I'm technologically savvy. I shouldn't be afraid of these things. Okay. I say that, and now I'm looking at how many windows I have open and wishing otherwise. Yeah. Okay. So let me just show you, for instance. Here is. What am I sharing? What am I sharing now? Can you guys see this other one that I'm sharing, or is that? Yeah, I can't. How funny is that? It's closed on mine. All right, let me show you this and see if I can actually view it. No, it's not permitting me to see. Oh, here we go. There we go. Yeah. All right. So this is an example of a writing exercise that I would run. This is first thought ideas. Keep your hand moving. Don't cross out. Don't worry about spelling, punctuation, or grammar. Lose control. Don't think. Get logical. Don't get logical. This is from Natalia Goldberg. And then I'll prompt them with a series of aphorisms. Here's a series of aphorisms. These is just a random set. And then we do a first thoughts exercise. So, this is just a basic getting people to think through what the work of writing actually is. Free writing is very straightforward. It's just something that helps people generate words. It helps people separate out editing and thinking. Free writing is something that even if you find writing difficult, it doesn't mean that you're further from writing well than other people are. That's just one example of something that I do. Let me show you a naming exercise. This is a Parklea writing workshop naming exercise. I go through and I collect all of the men's names. So I'm not going to show you this because obviously it's got people's names who you could look up, I guess, if you tried. But what I do is I spend a lot of time looking up the etymology of all the men's names, their first name and their last name. A lot of them are called John. John's a really common name, but I go through the literal meaning of their name, and then I look up, and then I talk about the contextual meaning of their name. Why were you named this? Do you know any other people who were named this in your family? Have you ever used this name before? And then we do another exercise where write down all of the thoughts about the meaning of your name. This is often a very profound experience for the men. They'll discover that their name means something that feels very akin to a sense that they have of their own self or soul. And then again, we do a kind of writing exercise and we reflect on the power of names. The reason for this activity is, I guess, self-evident, but there's one of the things that I found when I started work in prison is how many people go by names that aren't their own. How nobody gets called by their first name. None of the officers know any of the men's first names. If I say, how's John doing today, they will need me to say his surname because they don't know who I'm talking about. None of the officers let other people know their names. Nobody uses their actual name. They all have kind of nicknames or names that they got on the yard. And so this is a way of kind of returning and grounding us into the meaning of our own names. That's just one other exercise. Sometimes it's about reading an actual story. So here I've got the story Living Like Weasels by Annie Dillard. Can you guys see that? Is that on the screen as well? No, it just disappeared. I don't know why. Oh, I do know why. I beg your pardon. It's frozen because I'm trying to be too ambitious. That's why. Let's try again. It's not sharing, is it? Is it given up it's given up the ghost? Okay. I think it's, oh no, did that just work? Yeah. It's because I don't have, I've got two screens. So this is a story by Annie Dillard. And at the end, we talk about doing a set of writing activities based on living purely and mindlessly. One of the things that I often take from Dillard is this idea of what would it mean, she says, to live any way we want. People take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, even of silence by choice. The thing is to stalk your calling in a certain skilled and supple way, to locate the most tender and live spot and plug into that pulse. This is yielding, not fighting. A weasel doesn't attack anything. A weasel lives as he's meant to, yielding at every moment to the perfect freedom of single necessity. Ever since I started teaching this story, I've been struck by the fact that I'm working with a group of people who are typically describe themselves as addicts. Most of them are going through AA or NA. And the idea of kind of single-mindedness and obsession and single necessity is something that is not alien to them. And what I get them to do then is to talk, the Dillard story is not only about kind of thinking about this idea of kind of living through impulse or by necessity, but also about experiencing the wild. And I get them to do a piece of nature writing, and I show them other examples of that. Okay, so listen, I have lots and lots of these. I've been doing it, as I said, for 4 years. But I'm just going to see if I can get back now to my, yeah, okay, let's see if this is going to work again. Are we back? Awesome. Wow, that was easy. I also talk about prison. Oh yeah, this naming exercise is a Liesl Mueller poem where they have to write a CV of their life. Sometimes I just share with them poetry that's been written by people who are incarcerated. So somebody suggested teaching the Ballad of Reading Gaol. One of my favorite ones to teach is Leonard Peltier, who, if any of you know, Native American activist, was convicted of killing 2 federal agents in the 70s and is still incarcerated, despite the fact that he's about 80 now. And they've asked for grants of clemency for decades. And he writes this: I have no present, I have only a past and perhaps a future. The present has been taken from me. I'm left in an empty space whose darkness I carve out with a knife of my mind. I must carve myself anew out of the razor wire nothingness. I will know the ecstasy and the pain of freedom. I will be ordinary again. Yes, ordinary. That terrifying condition where all is possibility, where the present exists and must be faced. I mean, I can talk about this one for many hours, but the thing that I've always discovered is most profound for those that I teach this to and didn't really strike me is the experience of timelessness that coincides with incarceration, what it means to have a present taken away, and what it means to kind of demand of people who are incarcerated to improve and to rehabilitate when the promise of kind of living in the moment, in the presentness, is removed, and instead the past looms large and the future is kind of fraught with all kinds of possibility. Goodness gracious, I'm mindful of where we are with time. I also work at Jedidiah Women's Correctional Centre. Jedidiah is a maximum security facility for female offenders, as they say. It's part of a big correctional complex. A couple of us are going out there next week, actually, to go to a morning tea to celebrate the completion of our first pilot. We've got another pilot starting in July. With Sam Spall, who's a philosopher, I ran a pilot of 6 kind of 2-hour, almost what you would call like a liberal arts class. There's a philosophical aspect and then a creative one. Sam would bring analytic philosophy and teach the women how to do a kind of basic piece of philosophical thinking. I would do poems and we would share poems, and then I would set a piece of creative work for them to do. We co-designed it with the women who picked a series of themes that they wanted to work on. And they would submit that work each week, kind of for the following week, and we would discuss it. I would love to talk more about this, and I don't think I necessarily have time if I want to take any questions, which I do. But this program was just funded by FAS, kind of amazingly, I have to admit. I didn't anticipate that. we got a little bit of funding to kind of pay for an RA to do it again. And so we're going to run a 10-week iteration of it. My idea in doing this, incidentally, is to hamstring the university into feeling obliged to actually work inside of prisons. Like I think it's wild that we don't. And so this is a kind of way of establishing trust and partnership and relationship, but is also a way of kind of testing the convictions that not only can people inside cope with what is not at all different really from a university classroom, but that it's something that people desire and thrive. We could only take 10 women the first time that we ran it. We had 47 women who signed up to do it, so we had to select out of that. In the Parklea writing workshop that I do, at any one time, you can only have about 30 men in that unit. And so I should say that there's a kind of aspect of this, which is people who are opting in to do this are very often people who have committed a lot of kind of time and energy to improving their lives already, or they're people who are fed up. A really common story that I get are people who are coming in having been, arrested for the final time in their minds and who are ready for change. I have more poems in this that I'm going to kind of skip past. Just to say that another poem that I regularly teach is Dwayne Betts's Prison. Dwayne Betts famously, now he's a Yale law student, and he's a poet and an artist, and he was incarcerated from 16 for a carjacking. The final thing that I'll mention is Paper Chained, which is a magazine that publishes the writing and artistic expression of incarcerated people. We're really lucky in that corrective services have made it available on tablets that sentence inmates get. This is the most recent issue, issue 10. I've actually published something in this one. I think it's probably the best piece of creative reporting that's done in Australia inside of prisons, but it's one of the premier magazines, I think, in the world. It's a really beautiful piece of work. And it's run by two people who are formerly incarcerated, Damien Linane, who's the editor, and then it was the graphic designer, was also formerly incarcerated. And hopefully it will only grow and take on more people and actually become a pathway for employment and opportunity. I have another poem as well, which I'm going to skip by. But I should say that it's one of my favorite poems to read, particularly to the men in Parklea, because it lets me tell them that I love them at least 4 times, which is true. So let me just finish really quickly. Like, what do we actually owe incarcerated people? And this is hopefully kind of getting to the question that Hugh raised, and the great risk of how we defend arts on the basis of something that is itself kind of dangerous, feasibly kind of easy to describe as fundamentally not working. I had a series of slides here, which is this idea of hospitality that I take from Henry Nouwen, who was a priest and a psychologist and a great thinker and writer. And he talks about what teaching can achieve in this notion of hospitality, the creation of a free space. He describes this notion that one of the things that a teacher is obliged to do is to take away the veil covering their students' own intellectual life and to help them see that their own life experiences, their own insights and convictions, their own intuitions and formulations are worth serious attention. One of the things I think that the arts permit, and particularly in doing creative writing and poetry permits, is a kind of space where there is opportunity, not inevitability, but opportunity, a free space where men and women who are used to feeling this sense of unwelcome, apathy at best, and a kind of violence at worst, can come in, and instead of being suspect, instead of being my enemy, can come in and not be changed by me and the work that I'm doing and work that others like me do, but instead to come into a space where they can, if they choose and if it's possible and if it's permitted and if there's time enough, might experience something like change themselves, but that there is very clearly no dividing line between myself and them. The paradox of hospitality, according to Nouwen, is that it creates a kind of emptiness It's not filled with the ego of the teacher. It's not filled with all of the kind of necessary outcomes that were described by corrections as what this thing must achieve. But instead, it's a creation of a space where myself and my students, and I describe them as students, can enter into a kind of fearless communication where our own lives and experiences are the kind of primary source of growth and maturation. In a sense, it's terrible for those of us who might believe in the kind of purity of art, but there is a way that an inevitability that a lot of this art ends up becoming a kind of conduit for thinking about our own, experiences and our own sense of self. But of course, that's inevitable in what we all do, whether we admit to it or not. And so some things that I have heard and seen and so believe, and I'll just sort of say this as a polemic and then shut up, which is that sharing art actually creates a space within a prison that is not a prison, at least can be if it works and is done well. Generous hospitality always reveals the fact that every man and woman who is on the inside, as Liam points out, has gifts of their own to bring. And that actually giving people an opportunity to bring a gift is one of the primary tools of incarceration to kind of remove from people, right? You can't do any good while you're inside. You can't be generous. You can't contribute. You can't change your own community and do well. All you can do is work on yourself. And I think that's a grave error of rehabilitation. That in fact, we need to give people opportunities to dignify themselves through giving things to other people, to me, to each other, and even ideally to people beyond the walls. There are, I think, few things as powerful or revelatory or revolutionary as being in a room where people awaken to the fact that they have an inner life that they're interested in. Writing in that way can operate as a kind of liberation. I think, and I think you made this clear, that, we need to be alive to the conditions and realities of systems that actually describe people can change and people can't change, right? There's a sense in which once you've made your way inside a prison, we perceive you as unchangeable. One of the things that teaching, and certainly teaching kind of creative work, has to admit to is the possibility of change. And then just to say a few more things, many folks on the inside don't ever get to witness their own creativity. They don't get to enjoy the thrill and love of art. And I think seeing it happen live, and sometimes for the earliest times, reaffirms its value to me, just for that sheer fact. Prisons offer a kind of petri dish for witnessing the value of art, in part because it is so bereft of it. It's so devoid of beauty or opportunity or freedom. And it shows that art is kind of much more muscular and not as meek and small as we're made to believe in public discourse. But also that art inside testifies to how unimaginative we are to have prisons like we do, how our kind of vengeful attitude and our brutishness is a failure of imagination. To that question that was raised before, like, what do they do? What do they achieve? What Natasha was saying, I think that reading and sharing in this kind of work of the imagination and in art also permits us and encourages us to think about the system itself. And the reason that I work particularly in Paper Chained is to remind us that those voices of people on the inside also need to be part of that conversation. Our inclination is to keep it out of sight and out of mind. So that is a very speedy version of things. I haven't given people heaps of time to ask questions, but I'm happy to take them as they come. There's lots more to say, but I hope that was kind of illuminating and helpful and interesting for people. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share with everyone.
Was such a wonderful presentation, so informative, so comprehensive, so thought-provoking. Thank you so much. And yes, there obviously is much more to say, and perhaps we do need to think about, having some more, arranging some more time and space to do that. But I don't want to take up others' time. Does someone have, a burning question that they'd like to ask? We have, a little time. So, Hugh, I don't know whether you would like to ask that question. I know that Jed's addressed it in part, but would you like to start?
Thanks, Robin. Now I feel I have to.
I know.
But I mean, just first of all, to say thank you, Jed. I mean, I know I said thank you in the chat, but that was really wonderful. And the work you're doing is just both fascinating and important and just really wonderful. If I have a question, it would be a kind of more general one about the kind of violence of education and whether or not that's heightened in your experience of it in the prison context, or perhaps lessened, maybe. So I often have, so everything we do in education is always about changing people, because, you know, we have learning outcomes, and those outcomes always mean that people are different at the end of what we do. And my fear when I go into a classroom is that I have no right to do that. So my own kind of doubts as an educator are always around the violence of imposing myself on people and this desire that I have to make them think differently, when it may be better that I don't. It may be better that I don't impose that demand on them. And I'm just wondering, I mean, it may be that most people don't share that doubt about their role as an educator, but it's certainly one that informs, I think, the way I approach my work in the university classroom. And I'm wondering about whether or not that is something you share, and if you do, like, how would that play out in the different contexts of a classroom in a prison?
Yeah, I think, well, I think there's a long conversation to be had around that. Honestly, like, I don't say that as the kind of easy way out, but I think one of the solutions to that for me is maybe in some of that stuff that I just shared on hospitality. And I didn't get to talk much about it, but it's something that I would probably say is one of my key philosophies around teaching, because I think that you're right in often describing the teacher-student relationship as incredibly kind of one-sided, as suspicious, as violent as you describe. And what it looks like for me as an educator, particularly as an educator coming into a space where people have experienced the kind of failure of education at many, many levels. Many of the guys talk about the fact that they've been kind of kept to the periphery of conventional education, put in special classes, treated as kind of special cases since they were 5, since they were 6. And so what does it mean to try and create a space where people are coming, if they come at all, to a set of realizations? It's not because I am in charge of kind of nudging them through sort of all of my machinations toward that, but just the sheer fact of the coming together and the generosity of the space and the sharing. One thing that I didn't actually get to show you, Hugh, is I do a poetry sharing exercise where I actually just spend all this time trying to describe and demonstrate what it looks like for me to be someone who loves things, in a way, because it's kind of vulnerable and awkward and dorky and ingratiates myself to some people, but also because I think that very often what we're demanding from people is not their love or enthusiasm or the fact of them sharing themselves, but we're after a very peculiar, specific thing. We want the outcome. And so I do a lot of work trying to be a host of a room and not a kind of, an autocrat or an expert. And I think prison demands that, really, because most of the power of prison is the power of taking away. We have your good things, and if you want the good things, you have to behave, and then we'll give them to you. And I just want to have a kind of unadulterated good space that doesn't demand that anyone leave there quote unquote changed. But I have to admit, still hoping that if people do want change, and many of them do, and they articulate that, like they describe it, very practical, concrete change. I want to go home. I want to be with my partner. I want to see my children again. Then if that's the case, I'm also trying to be receptive to that. And, very often what they want are very practical tools. They don't want to listen to poetry. They want me to help them write a CV or help them work through what it's like to write a letter to a son that you haven't spoken to for 3 years. So, but it's much more about that, I think, that kind of generous exchange that I hope I do well. But I agree. Yeah.
And Natasha,
Is there anything that's happening in Queensland that you know? I mean, that's where I'm based. So have you done any research? There's things happening there?
There is. You know what, I don't know where you are in Queensland, but the University of Southern Queensland is the hub. It's the hub for incarcerated student strategy. They are, so they run a program out of there called Making the Connection, and they provide educational pathways for incarcerated people. I was talking to Anna as well, who mentioned someone who's working in theatre up there, who's worked in Shakespeare. Obviously, Hugh and Liam both teach Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is one of the things that has been historically taught the most inside of prisons.
Wow. Okay.
But yeah, I would start with USQ. Making the Connection is a kind of conduit for finding out everything that's happening up there.
No, that's right. Because I've just done a course, Uni of Tassie, called it's an undergraduate certificate or diploma in creative arts and health, and basically the benefits of the arts for mentally ill, physical, whatever, arts for all, basically, in a nutshell, which I've always agreed with and that kind of stuff. And there was a component about poetry and all that kind of stuff. So this is really interesting.
Awesome.
So I just, I'd like to, I don't know, volunteer or something, just get contacts and go from there. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear the leaf blower behind me incidentally now? Is that awesome? I can't hear you now, but I maybe just Alessandra, and then Robin, you're welcome to.
Yeah. Alessandra?
Cool. Jed, can you hear me?
Yep. I'm going to leave.
Thank you for that beautiful prezzo, and also for introducing me to the concept of that hosted space at the symposium last year, which is transformative. Thinking about those spaces you create in prison as a sort of beautiful hosted space, vulnerability, very supported, potentially transformative. How do people sort of hold that good space for themselves when they're in a different context outside prison? Is it something that you, is it something that you're, I don't know how to ask this question. Is it a thing?
It is. Yeah. You know what? That is one of the reasons why I think our university needs to be more invested in this work, because I am one person. I visit people's mothers and go to court and, have coffees with people when they come out of prison. And I stretch myself impossibly thin, but I can't create that reality on my own. And it's definitely, my hope, I say to all of them that I don't disappear or evaporate after a class, that I'm a public person. But no, how that happens interpersonally, like in the individual soul, is one of the hardest things to know, right? The worst metric in the world is reoffending, and that's the one that we have. How do we know if you've succeeded, you don't commit crime again, which is just a wild and inaccurate tool. But there's a really good book by a guy called Bruce Weston called Homeward, and he spends a year with people who have left prison. And he's an Australian originally from Queensland, but now works at Columbia. And he tries to describe like what is needed and what needs to happen and what conditions everyone really needs to kind of thrive coming out of an environment like that. It's a massive post-release is, I think, maybe second only to people going in the first place. Post-release is the biggest challenge that we face. And it's something that an institution of our size could meaningfully intervene in, and we don't yet. But I hope to be here for as many decades as it takes to make it more than what it is right now. Yeah.
It definitely didn't mean that you should do this personally.
No.
Take this on. But like helping them to sort of hold that for themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I don't get to chase them. I don't get to follow them after they leave. It is really up to them at a certain point. And I think that you have to have that kind of grace to, I've seen a couple of people back in my workshop, right? And that's the weirdest thing. You don't want return students. But when they come back, it's like, okay, let's start again. Like, there's nothing lost. But yeah, knowing what happens for somebody on the outside, there are so many conditions that make it impossible to succeed. And so my hope is that there's a kind of inner condition that has been cultivated. one day maybe I'll have that conversation with someone who tells me it directly and explicitly. You know, the conversation that every teacher dreams about, where someone's like, that really made a difference for me. It hasn't happened yet. I really only get that feedback in the context of class. But yeah, I don't do it for that reason, but I think you're right. I think that would be something I'd love for our institution in part to support and develop, so that people have a pathway when they leave that isn't just back to the conditions that they started in. Yeah.
100%. Thank you.
Yeah. Also,
Jed, I'm sorry that we have to finish up now, but I think that this has been a very powerful presentation and for all of us, and I think it opens up lots of thinking about, you know, you shouldn't be doing this on your own. There are perhaps lots of implications for all of us about what we can do, and I think that Create might try and host something perhaps with Ghana as well, you know, to follow through on, you know, a lot of those questions that you've raised today. So I'm sure that you all join with me in thanking you very much for what you're doing, but also for what you've done for us today. Thank you so much.
thank you, everyone. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And if you haven't joined Create, please think about it. The Create Centre at the University of Sydney. Till next time, thanking you.